All right, here we go, comrades, friends, fellow travelers, curious onlookers, haters. You're my fuel. We're really starting to organize with the Center for Political Innovation, and if you have, you just like to do other things while you're learning, I love to have a quality audiobook. So some people have put together some audiobooks for Caleb's books. Caleb Maupin has written a considerable amount of very readable, excellent material. If you haven't subscribed to his YouTube channel, you absolutely should. Although I would imagine if you're listening to this book, you're very familiar with Caleb. But either way, before we get started, our political group is CPI USA, and this is the website. And I felt that we need to have a readily available audiobook of our handbook. So that's what I'm going to do tonight. We're going to get it loaded up and shared here. And before I forget, I need to open GarageBand so I can record this at a higher quality so I can go back and edit it and perfect it later on. So let's make sure this is going and we got the right input. Yes. So hit record on that. That is going. And now we will start sharing the various parts of the book here. All right. So this part, I am going to make a quick, there we go. And we'll do it that way. Okay. So let me open all the pages I need to open here before we get reading. There we go. Open with preview. Big wide book, so it took up most of the scanner, which I appreciated. And let's find our tab right here. Present, share, and share the window, which is this one, I believe. Oh, looks like I missed the very first one. So I'll share that first, just so you can see it for completion's sake. There it is. There's the beautiful cover. Nice book. I also need to put, I will put in the description page where you can buy your own copy. But if you want to order like 10 or 20 copies, get in touch with CPI directly through the website, and I think we can get you a deal. We can get you a deal, so you don't have to give it all to Amazon. All right. So now we can get going here. We are city builders is the first page right there. And I took a screen cap of this part. Figure out how to share that one with you. And then we'll really get going. I'll timestamp where we really start reading here. There's the first page. We are city builders by our ideological leader, Caleb T. Maupin, and just all around great guy. The Center for Political Innovation educational manual. And now let's really get into the meat here. I'm going to read for an hour tonight. And we'll do it in hour chunks until I get it all done. Is this the one? Looks like it. Let's make it big. Let's make sure it's showing over here. It is. Okay. I think we're good to go. I'm going to set an hour-long timer on here and read away. 1 hour. There we go. All right. This is the CPI educational manual. We are city builders. Center for Political Innovation, put out in 2021, written by Caleb Maupin. The Center for Political Innovation is dedicated to educating and fostering visions for a future beyond capitalism. That is our goal. And really, I love Caleb's writing. It's very clear, and I always learn so much. And after it's over, I'm like, wow, that makes so much more sense. I can see the forest for the trees. So let's get started. Here we go. Contents. 1. City builders and vandals in our age. The legacy of Gilgamesh, Confucius, and Socrates. The death of Julius Caesar. Vandals bring on the Dark Ages, a new order forged by revolutionaries. The emergence of scientific socialism, imperialism, and the crisis of Marxism. The Atlanticist pathology, a mindset from hell. The party of a new type. Socialist construction and the rise of Eurasia. Victories for all humanity. Revolutionary intelligentsia and the broad masses. The synthetic left. Susan Sontag's new definition of fascism. The rise of the color revolutions. China's great adjustment. The nature of 21st century socialism. The pending Gotterdammerung. The unfolding low-wage police state. The psychology and politics of destruction. The potential for American rebirth. The case for socialism. The Malady by Maciej J. Olgan, 1934. The Parable of the Water Tank by Edward Bellamy, 1897. Why Socialism by Albert Einstein, 1949. Revolutionary Methods and Movements. Proletarians and Communists by Karl Marx, 1848. Report on an investigation of the peasant uprising in Hunan province by Mao Zedong, 1928. Madison Square Garden speech by U.S. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, 1936. A Century for the Common Man by U.S. Vice President Henry Wallace, 1942. The Future. Letter to the American Workers by Vladimir Lenin, 1918. Talk on the Question of Philosophy by Mao Zedong, 1964. Acknowledgements. Thanks to everyone who worked with the Center for Political Innovation to make this text possible. Special thanks to Denise Rampula for her proofreading and to Jason Ross for his layout. Special thanks to Eve Chin for arranging the cover design. Special thanks to Robert Lawrence for writing many of the questions for study and discussion. Special thanks to Lily Goldklang, Charlotte Forrester, Michael Pelagatti, and Ramiro Funes for their additional input. City Builders and Vandals in Our Age by Caleb T. Maupin, 2018. Throughout human history, two distinct trends have most certainly been present among us. There have always been city builders. They are the innovators, scientists, philosophers, unifiers, heroes, poets, painters, architects, preachers, prophets, dreamers, and visionaries. They include the egalitarians, solidarity builders, rationalists, optimistic nonconformists, bright-eyed rebels, advocates for the downtrodden, inspirers, and motivators. In essence, those individuals who push civilization towards a higher state of being. They are driven by an inner flame of creativity and boldness. These city builders have always stood in opposition to the efforts of the Vandals. These are the raiders, machine breakers, hate mongers, ignorance celebrators, jealousy peddlers, demagogues, cultists, hedonists, self-destructive stoics. They are wreckers, persecutors, lynch mob leaders, dope pushers, snake oil salesmen, sadists, crucifiers, vulgar emotionalists, crass pornographers, bullies, and bombers who often worship darkness and primitivism. The designations of left and right in politics are rather new relative to the history of human civilization. On May 5th, 1789, the people of France formed a National Assembly. This was the body that would lay the basis for the revolution and the toppling of the feudal monarchy. Baron de Gauville described the scene, saying, "We began to recognize each other. Those who were loyal to religion and the king took up positions to the right of the chair so as to avoid the shouts, oaths, and indecencies that enjoyed free reign in the opposing camp. In 1791, those who sat on the left side of the French National Assembly, the opposing camp to those defending the old regime, began referring to themselves as the innovators. Soon, society at large began referring to them as the left." The concept of left and right in politics did not spread beyond France for at least half a century after that. The idea of socialism is even newer, emerging as a vaguely defined concept in the early 1800s in France, and not first used in the English language until 1822. Marxism did not originate as a movement until 1848. These concepts, left, right, socialism, Marxism, are anything but eternal, and in their short life, they have already encompassed a wide variety of diverse ideals and figures. However, these two distinct trends, city builders and vandals, have existed since the dawn of human history and class society. From the very moment we began domesticating animals and growing crops, there were those who wanted to perfect our ability to do so and drive us toward a more advanced way of being. And from the moment of civilization's birth, there have been those who wanted us to regress back toward hunter-gatherer civilization and reduce ourselves to a lifestyle closer to that of lower primates. The essence of the ongoing battle that has raged between civilizations and cultures, within civilizations and cultures, and even within individuals themselves, has boiled down to this question: will human beings utilize their gifts of rationalism and creativity to progress toward greater achievements in a better world? Or will they reject the distinct essence of humanness and descend toward the conditions of less intelligent species? The legacy of Gilgamesh, Confucius, and Socrates. In describing the uniqueness of the human species, Frederick Engels, Marx's close collaborator, observed, "The animal merely uses its environment and brings about changes in it simply by its presence. Man, by his changes, make it serve his ends. masters it. This is the final essential distinction between man and other animals. Engel's observation was correct, and it has been mastering the environment and creating better conditions for human beings, so that we might live longer and in better comfort. That has been the task of the city builders in every age. As civilization dawned, the city building tendency manifested itself on every continent and among every people. No region or society had a monopoly on innovation. In the Americas, the Incas and the Mayas built pyramids and beautiful metropolises. In Africa, we saw the rise of city-states like Timbuktu and Carthage, and eventually the wonders of Egypt. Confucius and his brilliance lives on to this day in the unfolding victories of Chinese civilization after 5,000 years. In what is now Iraq, we saw the birth of a civilization called Mesopotamia. The central myth of this society was told in the Epic of Gilgamesh. The legend told of the protagonist, Gilgamesh, battling the bull of heaven, a mighty and powerful creature. Gilgamesh was able to defeat this massive animal by employing his intelligence. The narrative explains that despite being smaller and weaker, human beings are indeed superior to even the largest and most powerful beasts. The spark of creativity and the ability of rational thinking and collective effort makes us superior to all other species, no matter how large and powerful. The modern-day tradition of bullfighting can be traced back to Mesopotamia, where the legend of Gilgamesh was acted out in a ritual to demonstrate the distinction between animals, humans, and animals. The great thinkers of Athens articulated notions of democracy and wrangled with the nature of truth and reality. Socrates, the founder of Western philosophy, was put to death because his ideas were too threatening to the status quo. Socrates was accused of corrupting the minds of the youth and creating sympathy for Sparta, the rival city-state. The words of Socrates on his deathbed, as recounted in Plato's Phaedo, point toward the common mindset of city builders in every age. Socrates told his followers, when he knew his execution was imminent, "The same dream came to me, sometimes in one form and sometimes in another, but always saying the same or nearly the same words: cultivate and make music." The dying teacher urged his students to give up their attachment to the bodily sensations of pain and pleasure. The lovers of knowledge are conscious that their souls, when philosophy receives them, are simply fastened and glued to their bodies. The soul is only able to view existence through the bars of a prison, and not in her own nature. She is wallowing in the mire of all ignorance and philosophy, seeing the terrible nature of her confinement. And that the captive, through desire, is led to conspire in her own captivity. When he knew his execution was imminent, Socrates reported, "The same dream came to me, sometimes in one form and sometimes in another, but always saying the same or nearly the same words: cultivate and make music." Socrates believed that human beings were not simply animals avoiding pain and seeking pleasure, but they had a higher intellectual ability, a soul capable of reasoning and construction. Socrates' bravery in becoming a martyr for the cause of civilization set a bold example for heroes of the future. Socrates became more powerful after death than he was in life. His ideas were preserved by those he taught and were utilized in training great minds for thousands of years, illustrating a kind of immortality for progressive thinkers. Reactionary thought and vandal mindsets certainly manifested themselves as humanity marched onward in spite of them. The Roman Empire was a great manifestation of barbarism and savagery. Rome was a military society founded on holding back history, plundering other peoples, and living off tribute and slaves extracted at the point of a spear. The founding myth of Rome presents a message that seems completely opposed to the founding myth of Mesopotamia and illustrates the difference between the two civilizations. The legend of Rome's founding told of two twin brothers abandoned by their father and left to die by the river as infants. Romulus and Remus, according to the legend, were never loved and cared for by humans, but rather were nursed and raised by a she-wolf. The Romans believed that the strength which enabled the two co-founders to establish the mighty empire flowed back from their lack of humanity. The lack of human affection and the exposure to the wild predator mentality was believed to have enabled Romulus and Remus to grow into effective conquerors who could establish a slave society. In the Roman Empire, cruelty, sadism, and indifference toward the suffering of others were celebrated traits actively cultivated by the rulers. As Rome's agricultural and industrial output gradually decreased, and a highly inefficient slave system of production in its plantations and mines, Rome continued to make up the difference by conquering other peoples. The German scholar Karl Kautsky reflected on Rome's reactionary nature, writing, "The slave economy did not denote a technical advance, but a step backward. Not only did it make the masters impotent and incapable of working and increase the number of unproductive workers in society, but it also cut down the productivity of the productive workers and checked the progress of technology, with the possible exception of some luxury trades, like every mode of production that is founded on contradictions. The ancient slave economy dug its own grave. In the form it finally took in the Roman world empire, it was based on war. It was only continual victorious wars, continual subjugation of new nations, continual extension of the territory of the empire that could supply the masses of cheap slave material it required. The Roman Republic had a hereditary Senate, elected representatives, and elements of democracy for the simple reason that this was a better way of motivating its citizenry to plunder. A population that feels somehow involved in the business of governing and the distribution of loot is far more motivated to join wars of conquest than those who simply exist as subjects of an autocrat. However, the limited democratic procedures within the city-state empire proved to be too dangerous to the small elite of families who held the actual power. The death of Julius Caesar. The typical Roman was a hedonist who bet money on Colosseum fights and chariot races while seeking pleasure from orgies, drunkenness, and overeating, often to the point of induced vomit. The archetype of a shallow, pleasure-hungry sadist who was actively cultivated by the empire. These included gladiatorial shows, infanticide, and other barbaric practices designed to stimulate the primitive side of the human mind. For the minority of Romans, whose intellect would not allow them to be satisfied by hedonism, the Stoic cults emerged to satisfy their need to find deeper meaning in life. For the Stoics, the sadism of Roman life was replaced by a glorified masochism, dressed up in spiritual and philosophical pretensions. Romans who wanted more meaning in their lives than physical pleasure and cruelty would induce stages of supposed mysticism with ritualized self-mutilation, flagellation, or even starvation. The Stoics would drug themselves in order to have hallucinations, believing this to be a way of connecting to divinity. The Stoic Romans would worship some new god imported from part of the empire, forming little cults in the hopes of finding truths concealed by the official imperial gods. The Stoic Romans, who longed for something more out of life, would often be preyed upon by philosophical con men like Seneca. These charlatans preached on the supposed ethical merits of poverty while demanding huge sums in tribute from their flock. The apparent hypocrisy of various Stoic gurus and preachers became the subject of many Roman comedies. While the Romans who rejected the hedonism and cruelty of the empire were more intelligent and had potential to create real change, their ability to break with societal norms was simply channeled into another avenue of self destruction. Yet, even within this nightmare of historical reaction called the Roman Empire, the city building tendency within humanity asserted itself. Gaius Julius Caesar, a military man born among the aristocracy, emerged in the late Roman Republic to present a progressive vision. Michael Parenti's award-winning work of political science and historiography, The Assassination of Julius Caesar, A People's History of Ancient Rome, tells of a maligned populist and reformer who championed everyday Romans against the wealthy landowners. Parenti writes, he used state power to effect some limited benefits to small farmers, debtors, and the urban proletariat at the expense of the wealthy few. No matter how limited these reforms proved to be, the oligarchs never forgave him. And so Caesar met the same fate as other Roman reformers before him. Parenti's book, recounting the life and death of Julius Caesar, was the 2004 online review of books nonfiction book of the year. The same year that Parenti published his widely praised text, the Caucus for New Political Science gave him the Career Achievement Award. Parenti's scholarship was groundbreaking because it showed Julius Caesar in a completely different light, challenging the narrative put forward by William Shakespeare and the Roman historians who favored the perspective of the wealthy elite. Parenti draws from the words of those who demonized Caesar to show that their contempt was rooted in their own class interests. Parenti quotes sources such as the Greek biographer and essayist Plutarch, who accused Caesar of stirring up and attaching himself to numerous diseased and corrupted elements in polity. Parenti also quotes Appian, another Roman historian, who describes Caesar as having introduced laws to better the conditions of the poor. Julius Caesar, who sought to shift the Roman Empire toward a more sustainable and progressive role in the world and champion the proletariat, was stabbed to death by wealthy senators in 44 BC. The specifics of Caesar's reforms show him as a thoroughly progressive-minded leader. Caesar sent the unemployed proletarians of Rome to rebuild city-states throughout the empire in the hopes of making them thriving centers of trade. Caesar constructed public libraries, giving the citizenry access to written records and information. Caesar cracked down on moneylenders, lifted the restrictions and penalties on debtors, and imposed luxury taxes on the decadent rich. Caesar granted Roman citizenship to all doctors and teachers, hoping to reward and cultivate the kind of people who would make Rome a center of science, civilization, and culture. Caesar was appointed by the Senate for a 10-year term as the imperator, or Roman head of state. On 3 occasions, Caesar was offered a crown, but each time he declined to become a monarch. Despite being a strong man, Caesar remained an advocate of democracy and was loved by the people. His power came from the thousands of Roman proletarians, free citizens with no property, who saw him as their champion against the wealthy landowners and senators. This mobilization of the people as a populari or a populist made Caesar far more powerful than any king or emperor could be. Caesar's vision for reconstructing Roman society involved mobilizing millions of people, not as plundering raiders extracting tribute, but as city builders, continuing the great project of making music, for which Socrates had been executed by a similarly cruel, short-sighted elite. Parenti explains, the Senate aristocrats killed Caesar because they perceived him to be a popular leader who threatened their privileged interests. The greatest sin of Julius Caesar in the eyes of the Roman elite was his talk of land redistribution, ensuring that a tiny oligarchy would not maintain a monopoly over the main sources of wealth for Roman society, the mines and plantations. Parenti quotes Plutarch in describing how Caesar's land reform law provided that almost the whole of Campania be divided among the poor and needy. Caesar also talked of granting citizenship to people throughout the rest of the empire. Parenti quotes Roman historian Cicero, who bemoaned that Caesar planned to confer citizenship not merely on individuals but on entire nations and provinces. If people in Central Europe, Persia, North Africa, and other conquered lands could join with the Roman people in setting the policies and enjoying the fruits of the empire, the civilization might be more sustainable. Having championed the common people, Julius Caesar was stabbed to death in the hall of the Roman Senate. Parenti explains the assassination. Caesar was branded a traitor to his class by members of that class. He committed the unforgivable sin of trying to redistribute, albeit in modest portions, some of the wealth that the very rich tirelessly siphon from state coffers and from the labor of the many. It was unforgivable that he should tamper with the system of upward expropriation that they embraced as their birthright. Caesar seems not to have comprehended that in the conflict between the haves and the have-nots, the haves are really have-it-alls. The Roman aristocrats lambasted the palest reforms as the worst kind of thievery, the beginning of a calamitous revolutionary leveling, necessitating extreme countermeasures. And they presented their violent retaliation not as an ugly class expediency, but as an honorable act on behalf of Republican liberty. The assassination of Julius Caesar, though it was met with riots and rebellions among the people, ultimately doomed Roman civilization. Some of the very senators who had stabbed Caesar wept by his funeral pyre. They realized that their empire needed a progressive thinker, a strong leader, an advocate of kindness, compassion, and solidarity to lead it towards something better. But yet, in love with their own profits, the greedy and rich had stabbed to death the very person who could save their empire from its own self-destructive, vandal tendencies. Vandals bring on the Dark Ages. The demise of the Roman Republic, marked by the stabbing of its greatest advocate and creation, was a historical turning point that paved the way for the empire's eventual decline and fall. With any notion of democracy being too dangerous to the rich and powerful, Rome descended into a naked autocracy with a string of emperors who claimed to be gods, leading it further and further down the road to decay. After the eventual fall of Rome came the Dark Ages and huge setbacks for civilization in Europe. As Rome declined, the weary and demoralized public began to give Stoics the upper hand. In its final years, Romans began trading in Bacchus, the god of pleasure and orgies, for a sanitized and redacted image of Jesus Christ, first worshipped secretly among the Jewish craftsmen. The Roman Emperor Constantine is said to have seen a cross in the sky and heard the words, "In hoc signo vinces," under this sign you shall conquer, inspiring his conversion to Christianity. However, history showed the opposite of what was supposedly promised by the divine voice. As Rome adopted a symbol representing a humble carpenter who preached a gospel of loving one's enemy, the savage empire crumbled. The fact that the Roman Empire fell almost simultaneously with its official embrace of Christianity has long been met with defensiveness by Christian scholars and historians. St. Augustine's book, The City of God, considered to be one of the most vital theological works in the history of Christianity, was intended to address this point. However, no defensiveness is really necessary. The teachings of Jesus Christ were obviously not intended for the purpose of building a society based on plunder. And the fact that they would play a role in destroying rather than strengthening such an empire should not be surprising. In the twilight years, the once powerful militaristic city-state could not even raise its own armies. The Germanic tribes, the Vandals, the Ostrogoths, the Visigoths, who played a pivotal role in Rome's ultimate demise, did not even battle Roman centurions. The decaying empire was so weak that it fought the Germanic tribes not with its own soldiers, but by hiring other Germanic tribes to fight on its behalf. As it reached its end, an empire founded on military plunder was so weak that it could not raise its own army to defend itself. Despite the reactionary nature of the Roman world order, the fall of Rome made conditions far worse. It took 1,100 years before Europe's population returned to what it had been at the height of the Roman Empire. The average height of people dramatically decreased due to a decline in nourishment and caloric intake. In their orgy of destruction, the barbarian tribes made a point of burning books and records and attempted to erase scientific progress. The barbarians of Central Europe had essentially beaten the Romans at their own game. The dying empire was brought down by pagan tribes who worshipped Odin, a god of valor and grit, who seemed to embody the animalistic tendencies of Romulus and Remus. Unlike the Romans, the Goths and Vandals did not even construct cities, but lived in the woods as nomadic raiders, plundering what prior civilizations had built. They ushered in an era of huge setbacks and very little human progress. A new order forged by revolutionaries. After centuries of feudalism and serfdom, it was a change in political theory, sparked by changes in the economy, that paved the way for something better. The Renaissance was not a random occurrence. In Italy, Britain, Bavaria, and other parts of Europe, the dawn of the Silk Road from Asia and travelers' observations of other civilizations in the Middle East, China, and elsewhere inspired a strand of progressive thinking. The achievements of the Islamic Enlightenment, an age of reform in the Arab world, as well as China's great advances, gradually trickled into the Western world despite brutal institutions that sought to repress them. Much like Socrates had experienced, often those who promoted science and questioned the backward nature of things were met with repression. Often those accused of alchemy or heresy were tortured, imprisoned, or burned at the stake. Yet despite so many setbacks, the flame of human progress was not extinguished. New ideas were smuggled in, and secret societies of educated people began to form in order to share the forbidden knowledge. One after another, forward thinking monarchs who aligned themselves with the new layer of travelers and thinkers began to encourage scientific research as well as groundbreaking artistic endeavors. The music of Bach, the paintings of Michelangelo, and the empowerment of figures like Leonardo da Vinci and Thomas More all flowed from a new mindset regarding the nature of government. In the Dark Ages, the feeling was that human beings were obliged to serve their natural superiors. However, the paradigm shift that defined the Renaissance of the 14th to 17th centuries was the notion of statecraft, the feeling that those who govern have an obligation to improve the conditions of the citizenry and serve the people. With a few forward-thinking monarchs allowing new thoughts to bloom, the inner light of humanity began to glow once again in Europe. When Copernicus composed his earth-shaking text on the revolution of heavenly spheres in 1543, the text was simply a presentation of what he had discovered with mathematical calculations and his primitive telescope. The text had no mention of politics in it, but the political implications were explosive. Copernicus had argued that the scientific method was a superior mechanism for finding truth, and that what the Catholic Church claimed about the earth being the center of the universe was false. Those who accepted the scientific method and belief in rational thinking began to refer to themselves as revolutionaries. The revolutionaries believed that the earth revolved around the sun. And more importantly, they believed in science and human reason. Across Europe, the revolutionaries conspired, sometimes openly, sometimes in secret, to challenge the feudal order and replace it with something that would no longer restrain human progress. The Korean invention of the printing press, utilized for the first time in Europe by Johannes Gutenberg, opened the door to the Protestant Reformation. By the late 1700s, revolutionaries were on the upswing, speaking of a new order protecting natural rights or the rights of man. Talk of life, liberty, and property, and liberty, equality, fraternity swept the world. Feudalism fell amid a wave of optimism. Jefferson's Declaration of Independence, marking the first step toward the creation of the modern United States, is awash with the slogans and sentiments of the era. It speaks of human beings as being endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. It speaks of the moral imperative to revolt against unjust social conditions. As the 19th century dawned, red banners and declarations of liberty were on display across the Western world. Kings and nobles were beheaded. Millions of peasants marched into battle in order to topple old principalities and to forge modern nation states with their muskets and bayonets. The old order, of course, scoffed with contempt at those who brought about its demise. Robert Thomas Malthus coined the term overpopulation. He proclaimed that the unrest was all due to the birth rate expanding faster than the food supply. The Spanish Inquisition, anti-Semitic pogroms, and various episodes of genocide and repression marked the vengeful scorn of a dying order. As capitalism dawned, the feudal lords were replaced by factory owners, and the power of kings was usurped by bankers. Peasants were driven from their lands and pushed to urban areas where they became wage workers. A new social order emerged from the ashes of the old. The dawn of the new social system, hailed as glorious, was wrought with horrors and inhumanity. A genocide cleared the Scottish highlands. Millions of Irish people were starved in a man-made famine. Colonialism in Africa and the Americas, the slaughter of native people, and the transnational slave trade laid the foundations of what would eventually become the global market. The emergence of scientific socialism. Political and economic theorist Henry de Saint-Simon looked on to the new French society created in a massive revolution and saw millions who were left hungry and destitute. He invoked Christianity and moralism and built cooperatives while providing charity to the poor. Saint-Simon began to speak of socialisme as an alternative to selfishness and individualism in the new society, where profits ruled and self-interest seemed far less restrained than ever before. The Welsh industrialist and social reformer Robert Owen followed after Saint-Simon, becoming the first to speak of socialism in the new language. He constructed egalitarian model cities in New Lanark and New Harmony. The utopians followed a long tradition of seeking to construct an ideal world, but the first time science that was applied to this project came amid the 1848 German Revolution. As a young man, the socialist revolutionary Karl Marx was a participant in a massive revolt that sought to create a German nation-state. The uprising was part of the Spring of Nations, a series of rebellions that swept Europe. The rebellions demanded the creation of democratic republics, social equality, and better conditions for the people. Like most of the 1848 uprisings, the German Revolution failed. Marx's faction in the 1848 revolution, the Communist League, presented a document called the Communist Manifesto to express its beliefs. The text presented arguments for a new social order beyond capitalism. However, unlike Saint-Simon and Owen, Marx's arguments were not rooted in moral criticism and religious sentiments, but rather rooted in an analysis of the history of human society and how it develops. Marx began his famous document with the words, "The history of hitherto existing society has been the history of class struggle." He explained the constant drive of human beings toward a higher mode of production, fueled by the conflict between different social classes. Prior to this opening statement, Marx's preamble declares, "A specter is haunting Europe, the specter of communism," arguing that the ideas he presented were well alive all across Europe, and the 1848 Manifesto was simply the first place to give a concise, popular voice to them. Marx spoke of the working class, the proletariat, a class of laborers who live only so long as they find work, and who find work only so long as their labor increases capital. These laborers, who must sell themselves piecemeal, are a commodity, like every other article of commerce, and are consequently exposed to all the vicissitudes of competition, to all the fluctuations of the market. He called for the working class to rise up and take control of society, rescuing it from the irrational greed of factory owners. The proletariat will use its political supremacy to wrest, by degree, all capital from the bourgeoisie, to centralize all instruments of production in the hands of the state, i.e., of the proletariat, organized as the ruling class, and to increase the total productive forces as rapidly as possible. The Marxists argued that factory owners lived by extracting surplus value from those they hired and operated only according to what was profitable. As a result, the new society unfolding across Europe was plagued by economic crises, war, hunger, and poverty amidst plenty. While the bourgeoisie had done great things by breaking apart feudalism, Marx argued, its new society presented fresh contradictions that could only be resolved by the working class rising up. Marxism argued that with the workers controlling the means of production, the economy could be rationally planned, and human progress would no longer be restrained by the anarchy of production. As Marx's close collaborator, Friedrich Engels, later explained, the purpose of the communist revolution was to establish a society where growth and human progress were unlimited. According to Marx's theory, with a state-run economy, humanity could be unleashed to gradually deconstruct all forms of social hierarchy and oppression. In a higher phase of communist society, after the enslaving subordination of the individual to the division of labor, and therewith also the antithesis between mental and physical labor, has vanished, after labor has become not only a means of life, but life's prime want, after the productive forces have also increased with the all-around development of the individual, and all the springs of cooperative wealth flow more abundantly, only then can the narrow horizon of bourgeois right be crossed in its entirety, and society inscribe on its banners, from each according to his ability to each according to his needs. The ultimate vision was for human productivity and creativity, after perhaps thousands of years, to establish so much material abundance that the need for any form of coercion or authority would fade away. In proportion as anarchy and social production vanishes, the political authority of the state dies out. Man, at last the master of his own form of social organization, becomes at the same time the lord over nature, his own master, free. According to Marx, the workers' revolution would lead to a centrally planned economy, and this would be the first step toward an ideal world in which people could simply take what they wanted and do what they felt like doing, from each according to his ability to each according to his needs. Marx's economic work explained the natural instability of profit-centered economies. He described workers' competition with machines, the falling rate of profit, and the drive towards cyclical market crises due to advances in technology. Marx stated that the more effectively a capitalist can carry out production, the fewer people he hires. In capitalism, human beings' ability to survive and prosper is tied to their inherent profitability to those who own the centers of economic power. Therefore, he argued that capitalism leads to a situation where abundance and efficiency creates unemployment, and poverty persists amid plenty. Marx's political writings analyzed the 1851 coup d'etat in France, in which Louis Bonaparte marched into power seeking to restore order and liquidate a nationwide episode of unrest and instability. Marx described how, in a time of crisis, factions among the ruling class began to violently suppress each other in the hopes of taking dramatic economic actions and stabilizing a naturally unstable system. Marx helped form the International Workingmen's Association, IWA. It was commonly called the First International in the hopes of spreading communist ideas across the world and uniting revolutionaries of different countries. Within the First International, Marx frequently polemicized with anarchists like Mikhail Bakunin and Ferdinand Lassalle, who advocated left adventurist violence and did not see revolution in a scientific way. Marx analyzed the Paris Commune of 1871, where French workers saw the capitalist government surrender to the invading Prussian armies. The workers established a short-lived working-class regime to defend their city. Marx had originally opposed the Communards' uprising. However, after it was underway, he praised it as an example of workers storming heaven and taking great risks to advance history and defend their communities. Marx said that the Paris Commune of 1871 was the first dictatorship of the proletariat, and that similar uprisings would soon sweep the world. Eventually, the First International broke apart due to factional disagreements between Marx's allies and anarchists. However, Marx observed the formation of the German Social Democratic Party, SPD, in 1875. He composed a pamphlet called The Critique of the Gotha Program, pointing out non-scientific aspects of its founding document. Eventually, the German SDP adopted Marx's ideas as its official ideology. Though Marx never visited the United States, he was employed by the New York Tribune, an American newspaper owned by abolitionist Horace Greeley. From London, Marx composed columns praising Lincoln and called the U.S. Civil War the Second American Revolution. Describing why working-class people across the ocean felt enthusiastic about supporting the anti-slavery war, Marx wrote, "The working men of Europe feel sure that, as the American War of Independence initiated a new era of ascendancy for the middle class, so the American anti-slavery war will do for the working classes. They consider it an earnest of the epoch to come that it fell to the lot of Abraham Lincoln, the single-minded son of the working class, to lead his country through the matchless struggle for the rescue of an enchained race and the reconstitution of a social world." Marx's followers played a key role in this war, with German communists who fled to the United States forming the Ohio 9th Infantry Regiment and fighting against slavery on the battlefield. Textile workers in Britain, organized into Marx's IWA, refused to work with cotton picked by slaves and held demonstrations supporting Lincoln and his Second American Revolution. While the British textile factory owners saw the U.S. South as a cheap source of cotton, and London and Wall Street insurance cartels saw slave exports as an opportunity to make profits, Marx argued that the interests of the working class people were on the other side. Marx wrote, "Labor in white skin cannot emancipate itself where the black skin is branded." Imperialism and the crisis of Marxism. The Marxist movement proliferated across Europe, most especially after the death of its founding prophet in 1883. The Socialist International, Second International, emerged as a continent-wide mass movement, with the German SPD as its flagship organization. Millions of working-class people joined Marxist, Labor, and Social Democratic parties. Unions fought for the rights of factory workers, universal male suffrage, restriction on the length of the workday, and union representation on the job was established in many parts of Europe. Socialist deputies were elected to many parliaments. Marx's writings were broadly distributed, and institutes of Marxist studies were established. The United States was not left out of the rise in socialist consciousness. Activist Edward Bellamy's science fiction novel, Looking Backward, was published in 1888. The text told of a beautiful, futuristic USA in which the rule of profits had been eliminated, and human beings lived in comfort and cooperation. The book created a sensation across the USA as a bestseller. People inspired by the novel formed nationalist clubs to promote the vision Bellamy's narrative presented. Among those who promoted his socialist vision was Edward Bellamy's cousin, Francis Bellamy. Francis Bellamy was a Baptist minister who later composed the U.S. Pledge of Allegiance. Daniel De Leon's Socialist Labor Party of America, and eventually the much larger Socialist Party of America, led by Eugene Debs, began to spread the Marxist gospel of social revolution and rational economics across the American heartland. Debs traveled in a red train car from city to city, calling for the working class to take its place as the master of U.S. society. Upton Sinclair, Ida Tarbell, John Reed, Lincoln Stevens, and other socialist journalists exposed the crimes of the rich and powerful. The industrial workers of the world organized the desperately low income and immigrant trade and industrial workers who were rejected by American Federation of Labor for being unskilled. In the first decades of the 20th century, Marxism was everywhere in the Western world, and the working class was more organized than ever before. Yet socialist revolutions did not occur. Scholars began to write about the crisis of Marxism because it seemed that while Marx's ideas had widely proliferated, they did not manifest themselves in the predicted proletarian revolution they were intended to create. The crisis of Marxism and the lack of revolutions and uprisings occurred because the global economy was changing. Factory owners were being usurped by bankers. As international corporations based in Western capitals spread themselves across the world, the living standards for some strata in the homelands were rising. Writing from Russia, Lenin described this new global order as imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism. Lenin wrote, "Imperialism is a specific historical stage of capitalism. Its specific character is threefold. Imperialism is monopoly capitalism, parasitic or decaying capitalism, moribund capitalism. The supplanting of free competition by monopoly is the fundamental economic feature, the quintessence of imperialism. Monopoly manifests itself in 5 principal forms. 1, cartels, syndicates, and trusts. The concentration of production has reached a degree which gives rise to these monopolistic associations of capitalists. 2, the monopolistic position of the big banks. 3, 4, or 5 giant banks manipulate the whole economic life of America, France, Germany. 3, seizure of the sources of raw material by the trusts and the financial oligarchy. Finance capital is monopoly industrial capital merged with bank capital. 4, the economic partition of the world by the international cartels has begun. There are already over 100 such international cartels which command the entire world market and divide it amicably among themselves until war redivides it. The export of capital, as distinct from the export of commodities under non-monopoly capitalism, is a highly characteristic phenomenon and is closely linked with economic and territorial political partition of the world. 5, the territorial partition of the world, colonies, is completed. The rise of the international market led to bankers supplanting factory owners, with industry depending on credit and lending in order to function. Unlike industrialists, bankers have a fundamentally anti-progressive historical position in relation to the world. For example, figures like Henry Morgan, Andrew Carnegie, and Henry Ford ultimately sought to see living standards in the United States increase. They viewed their own profits as rising alongside advances in technology and scientific progress. The various captains of industry could be ruthless in breaking strikes and crushing those who challenged their power and profits, but they still built libraries, financed public works, and on some level believed that their own advancement accompanied the advancement of the country and human civilization. King Leopold II of Belgium oversaw a mass genocide in the Congo in order to extract super profits for rubber corporations. The financial elite of creditors that usurped the factory owners and came to rule the world in the monopolistic associations which Lenin described had a completely different relationship with the world and with human history itself. This current represents nothing more than a financial middleman, accumulating its position and making profits through the lending of money, not production. In his time, Marx described the rise of what he called fictitious capital, writing, to the extent that the depreciation or increase in value of this paper is independent of the movement of value of the actual capital that it represents, the wealth of the nation is just as great before as after its depreciation or increase in value. The imperialists maintained their super profits by super exploiting countries across the developing world. In order for Wall Street and London to maintain their position as monopolist rulers of the global market, it was necessary to tear down any level of development that was taking place across the developing world. Great nations had to be reduced to the level of captive client states. The world had to be made poor and kept poor so that Wall Street and London could be made rich. The financialization of capital led to a new level of stability and also resulted in stratifying the working class of Western countries. As skilled workers and craftsmen saw their wages increase, they became far less interested in solidarity with industrial workers deemed to be unskilled. English-speaking, U.S.-born, and white workers in the United States banned foreign-born, non-English-speaking, and non-white workers from their labor unions. Most of the labor unions in the American Federation of Labor were openly racist, allowing only white workers to join. Lenin labeled this layer that emerged among the working class as the aristocracy of labor. It was made up of workers with higher pay who sympathized with the Western capitalists against lower paid workers and people in the colonized world. As the labor federations and Marxist parties became dominated by the labor aristocrats, they became far less interested in revolution. They also became far more sympathetic to militarism and hostile to foreign nations. Essentially, a section of the working class was being unconsciously bought off and becoming loyal to the bankers and their governments. All right, so I have stopped it in GarageBand. I'm going to save it. CPI, Educational Handbook. Save. I've captured it. All right, let's check out the chat. I haven't looked at all. Oh, man, look at this. Oh, buddy, I hope I'm doing a good enough job. I mean, you are a fantastic writer, buddy. It's just so clear, you know. You guys can Caleb has a Patreon too. You can always support him there. But I know for this one, me and him do our own things. But more than anything, this is the spread, CPI, far and wide. Caleb's though, just to have one. That's Caleb's Patreon. Mine is I like to do Buy Me a Coffee. I have a Patreon too, but I like the orange on Buy Me a Coffee. I'm a simple 35-year-old man. I like colors, brown and orange. And finally, more than anything, I think Caleb would agree, join CPI. It's $10 a month. You'll feel good that you did it. You can participate in our weekly Zoom calls where we're planning it out. We're planning out how to build socialism in America, because the ship's going down. And if we're going to have a government at all, we don't need to have a government for rich people. We need to have a government for working people, people that get out of the house every day. It's something to think about. Once you make enough money, where I live as a teacher, at a 7% return in the stock market, I need about $350,000 in passive index funds, and then I never have to go to work again. I can just sit back and collect $30,000 a year in interest, and I don't work anymore. To a lot of people, that's the American dream, but I think if you think it through, you'll sit at home about, let's say, 5 years on the couch playing Modern Warfare 16, and you'll eventually want to do something that makes you feel useful. So work is what makes us human. And we'll stop there today on page 24 at 1.1.7. And next week, we'll do another hour in until we get this all done. So be sure to, so what do they say? Like. The only reason I'm saying like is because I legitimately want this information to get out there. I don't say that on all my videos, but this one, we got to get it out there. And if you want to hear part 2 and you're not subscribed to my channel, go ahead and subscribe so it pops up when I do part 2 next week. All right. I love y'all. Caleb, I don't know if you're streaming tonight, but I never want to stream when you're not streaming. I think I'm going to go back to the very beginning of Michael Rossi's videos and start reading through all of his Putin Lavrov speeches just to have that. And I think I'm a halfway decent American English voice just to have those out there in redneck American. I tell my English students, we don't speak English in this country. We speak American. We beat the British for a reason, dadgummit. We ain't speaking their language no more. Anyway, I'll quit being goofy. And, yep, tune in. We'll give you all part 2 next week. I love you, and God bless.